Coach Casey gets win number 100, Saddiq Bey drops 51, and Jerami Grant drops 40. Omari talks with Dave Being, and the NCAA tournament is in full swing. All of this and more on The Pistons Pulse. Hello and welcome to your go-to Detroit Pistons podcast, The Pistons Pulse, co-hosted by me, Bryce Simon of Motor City Hoops, a former D1 Hooper, current high school coach, teacher, husband, and father of 3 amazing kids, and Omari Sankofa II, Pistons beat writer for the Detroit Free Press. Omari, Kansas had blizzard conditions, and I watched my 2-year-old eat a fruit roll-up out of the trash this past week while you, my friend, were in the sunny, warm state of Florida celebrating a friend's birthday while covering our Pistons. Man, I kind of feel like we're just essentially living the same lives here.
Well, it was like 19 degrees in Detroit before I left, so if anything, the Florida weather kind of balances that out. I mean, you were down here. You know how cold it was. You said the Detroit cold is different from the Kansas cold.
It hits different, man. It does, Omari. That cold weather hits different in Detroit.
Yeah, it does. So, yeah, I got some 80-degree weather, and now I'm back, and it's in the 50s now. So, hey, I have no complaints at all. But I hope everything's good with your kid, though. Eating the old fruit roll-up out the trash probably isn't a good situation.
No, and we'll talk about Saddiq Bey here in a little bit. I was doing a breakdown, and all of a sudden I look off to the side, and he threw it in the trash can. I was like, oh, man, what a waste. And then I look over 2 minutes later, and he's just pulling it out, eating it. And I think I even said, Wes was on the phone with me, I think I even said, no wonder you're sick all the time. I think so. He's actually been getting over a stomach bug and a cold and all that. So, I don't know, his immune system should be ready to go after all this.
Well, that's the bright side. You want them to get all this stuff out the way when they're like 2-3 years old. Then by the time they're 5, they're like a machine, and everything's already passed through.
Yeah, they keep rolling through, no doubt.
Before we get to today's episode, make sure you are following us on all social media platforms at Motor City Hoops, at Omari Sankofa, and at Freep Sports. Subscribe to Freep.com. Also, do us a favor and go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Leave us a rating, comment, and tell a friend about the Pistons Post podcast. Bryce and I both enjoy engagement from our listeners, so always feel free to reach out with comments about what you hear on the podcast.
Absolutely. We've had a lot of those recently. Guys, please hit us up on Twitter, shoot us an email, comment in Apple, Spotify, on the Freep website. We love all that engagement. And we do want to let everyone know we're recording this before the Pistons game Monday night against the Blazers. Just the way Omari's schedule works and all that, there's no way we could have it out to you Tuesday morning if we recorded after the game. So nothing will be discussed on this episode from that Monday night game. Luckily, this is the last time until next season where we'll be in this scenario. But with that said, Omari, we got some great things to talk about anyway, and let's start with probably the best performance, not even probably, it was the best performance of the week, and that was Saddiq Bey dropping 51 on, I believe it was it Thursday?
It was Thursday. And that was, a phenomenal game, obviously. I think Saddiq's probably on the short list of guys you would expect on the team to have a night like that, but you never know when it's going to happen. And, just to see him pop off the way he did, you don't see that very often. That was the first 50-point game for the Pistons since Blake did it 3.5 years ago.
Yeah, so you mentioned that he was just one of a few guys that you could expect that from on the Pistons. So no Cade Cunningham in that game. He missed a couple games. Jerami Grant also did not play in that game. So it was kind of a chance for Saddiq Bey to get it going and get hot and have a game like this. But 50 is still a ton of points. He had 21 in the first quarter, Omari, 30 at half. That's the fourth Piston to have a 30-point half in the last 25 years. Credit Keith Black-Trudeau for that one. Tied Dumars with 10 made threes. And the seventh Piston to have 50 with Yardley, Being, Tribuca, Stackhouse, Rip, and Griffin. I think what he did from three-point line, Omari, was just incredible. And as I went back and watched it, there was like a progression. His first 3 were catch-and-shoot threes, and then he started doing a little bit off movement. And then by the end of the game, Omari, it was just silly. Like, the final one was like a jab step, reverse between the leg, but no dribble. He didn't dribble it and knocked it down. You could just tell he was feeling it.
No doubt. And I think the biggest difference from Saddiq last year to this year is that he's not just a catch and shoot guy when it comes to threes. He can create his own shot a little bit. He's got the side step. It really has been fun to watch his progression as a three-point shooter this season. And then if he could keep this going, that really would unlock a different aspect to his game, because just being a movement shooter in today's league is just so devastating, and that would really unlock a lot for him.
Absolutely, yeah. It's one thing to be able to knock down, catch, and shoot, but if he can come off a staggered screen, knock him down, we saw a little bit of that. We saw the one you're talking about with the jab step. He did that a couple times. Like the one we're talking about that was like the playground move. Didn't really expect that from Saddiq Bey of all the guys on the roster. Talk about, what guys on the roster are going to do what. I wasn't expecting that from Saddiq, so he got a little bit of stuff to his game, but he's jab stepping guys, and obviously he got to the rim, hit some middies as well in that game. I know segment 2 is all about the quotes, and we're going to dive into those, but there was interesting quotes coming out of that about the green hair and why he has his hair green and kind of how he likes to play the villain, as we've talked about some superhero shows on the podcast recently.
Indeed. He told us probably a month ago that he really likes playing on the road. He likes the booze. He likes the crowd. He likes some of the smack talk you hear. And for him to grow up a huge fan of the Joker, he dyes his hair green, and then he goes into Orlando's arena and puts 50 up. And granted, that wasn't a normal home crowd. The normal road crowd. A lot of times you'll have a crowd where it's almost a playoff atmosphere, boos are raining down on you. But there are a lot of Michigan and Detroit transplants in Orlando. Orlando is like one of the handful of cities that people from Michigan move to when they're just tired of the code. And really a transplant city in a lot of ways. And there were a lot of Pistons jerseys in the arena. And at the end of the game, when it was clear the Pistons were going to win, you had a few thousand fans who were in the arena just cheering for Saddiq, cheering for the 50. He got a pretty rousing ovation when he left the court, walked down the tunnel. So that's got to be a gratifying feeling as a basketball player when you go into a different arena and you have folks cheering for you. I mean, that's normal for guys like Steph Curry and whatnot, but, it says a lot about the night Saddiq had as well.
So that's what I don't always listen to the broadcast. Like sometimes, and it's nothing against Blaha or Kessler or Johnny Kane. Like just my setup, I don't always have the volume on. But for that game, I did. Well, it was the only game, right? So we should make note of that it was on NBA TV. So I did watch it on the big TV. Usually, I just watch the games on my phone through League Pass. But I could hear some cheers. It was a weird scenario at the end of the game. They fouled him, so he's going to get to go to the free throw line. And I was like, man, I can't believe the Magic crowd is cheering for him to get 50 on their team, but that makes more sense that there were some Pistons fans in the stands.
That was actually my first time in Orlando as an NBA beat writer. I went when I was a kid, like 6 years old, so I remember it a little bit. It doesn't really count. But that was the only NBA city I had not been to, actually, and I had always heard that Orlando tended to be pretty pro-Pistons. So I saw it firsthand, for the first 50-point night. He had 51, but still a 50-point night in 3.5 years. A lot of Pistons fans in the arena for sure. And even just walking around the concourse before the game, definitely saw a lot of blue and red jerseys. So for him to be able to do that and still get a little bit of a hero's welcome was pretty cool to see.
So before we get to the other really big individual performance this week on Saturday, in that game, a Pistons win, Coach Casey also secured his 100th win as the head coach of the Detroit Pistons. I definitely wanted to make note of that. I realize Coach Casey's tenure in Detroit hasn't been met with a ton of success yet. And whether he ends up being the coach, I know some people, myself included, think maybe he slides into a front office role or something else over the next few years when this team really starts to compete. But I do think it's worth noting, and especially since this team has played pretty well since right before the All-Star break.
And the thing about Dwayne, he really does have the buy-in from all of the players. This isn't the front office that hired him, but they're bought into him as well. Of course, they gave him a extension around this time last year after the season ended. For the team to be competing this late into the season, I think says a lot. And this is not the situation he signed up for. When he was first hired, they were still a playoff hopeful team. You still had Blake, you still had Andre Drummond, Reggie Jackson. And injuries blew that up. And now you come into a team where it's a full rebuild. None of the players that he came in with are still here. The roster's been turned over, almost several times by now. But they're playing good basketball, and you can see the outlines of this team being really good. So we start with Dwayne Casey, then in Toronto, and he's a teacher. The players respect him, front office respects him, and definitely good to see him get win number 100, which I think understandably got overshadowed by Saddiq's 51. I'm sure he would hope that it doesn't take quite as long for him to get the next 50. So a lot of that comes down to how good they are next season.
Hopefully the next wins, the next 100, the next 50 for him happen a lot quicker than these first ones came. And unfortunately, Saturday night against the Cavs, the Pistons did not get a win. They were competitive, and we've seen that a lot. Even the games they haven't won since that Boston game before the All-Star break, where this stretch of good play has happened, even through some injuries with different guys, they've been competitive. Competitive lost Saturday night to the Cavs, but Jerami Grant popped off. It looked like maybe he was going to try to go for 50 and become the second teammates to go for 50 in back-to-back games here in a short amount of time, as the Brooklyn Nets, KD, and Kyrie Irving did it just not too long ago. He had 15 first-quarter points, 27 at half. He ended with 40 and 7 made threes. Just a really, really nice scoring performance from Jerami Grant on Saturday night.
It really was. And it did look like he was going to go for 50 for a while. 27 in the first half. I believe he made 6 of his three-pointers all in the first half. And I mentioned earlier, you have 3 guys on this team who can hit 50. I mean, it's those two. And Cade, and because Cade's a bit more of a playmaker, it's really just Saddiq and Jerami on most nights. So Jerami's career high was 43. It looked like for a while he was probably going to top that. But, as the game wound down, the Cavs are a good team, and they kind of locked down. But Jerami obviously is a really good basketball player. We all know that. It's fun to watch him heat up that way. And I know he would have liked it to end in a win, but still a really, I think, fun week of Pistons basketball. You don't expect a lot of fun this late in the season for a team that is almost guaranteed to have a top 5 pick. So for that to happen back-to-back, I think that was fun, not just for us media guys, but for fans as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Omari. Ever since the All-Star break, this team has been a lot of fun to watch. And we'll talk about the tank situation here in just a little bit before we move to segment 2. But we've had some big individual performances. We've had some nice games, some crazy insta games, overtime games, all of that stuff. It really has been a really fun team to watch when I think the only reason a lot of people were watching early, at the very beginning of the season, there was a lot of high expectations, right? But then you got through the first 20 games. Cade had been injured. Jerami was hurt. KO was hurt. Bay was struggling. I think the only reason people tuned in, if they were still tuning in, was to watch Cade Cunningham. Now I think people are really enjoying watching this team play as you see them develop some chemistry and also some other younger guys that are playing well.
You are, and I think the bottom line, and this is something we talked about, and even before the pod existed, me and some of the other beat guys have talked about on Twitter. But rebuilds are tough, and you don't know when things are going to click. It's a process, and especially for a team like this, where Jerami Grant missed 20-something games with a thumb injury. Kelly Olynyk was out for much of the season, and they just had no center depth at all. It was really hard to judge this team in a vacuum. Now, I was probably lower on their prospects than a lot of people were. I had them winning 28 games, finishing 14th in the East, and the games might be a bit high, but as far as finishing 14th in the East, that looks like it's probably close to being locked in at this point. But you're starting to see things gel. This team was getting smacked by 20 points every night earlier in the year. And now they've been competitive almost every single night for a month straight, and that's a very notable step forward, especially for the fans who looked at the net rating last year and they saw that the team was more competitive than their record, and they were disappointed this year because it looked like they regressed a little bit. I don't think net rating makes sense to look at for rebuilding teams personally. I think it matters, but at the same time, when you're bad, you usually don't get to dictate the course of a game. If you're playing a good team and you're a bad team, you don't get to dictate whether you lose by 5 or 15 points. That's the winning team's job. But you do see those scores getting closer, and they picked up some good wins over some good teams, and that does matter. I believe in momentum. I think this counts for next season, and guys are getting confident. So it's been fun to watch, and during the week for March Madness and NFL free agency, I've been crazy. People are still paying attention. So, yeah, this stuff all matters, and it's cool to see things starting to gel a little bit over a year into this thing.
There's so much stuff going on right now with NFL. Every day there's something breaking, some big NFL free agent or trade. The March Madness, obviously, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. Plenty of March Madness talk on this episode, guys, I promise. Before we talk about kind of the second unit and the quote-unquote tank and, draft position, I did want to bring up, so that's the first time the Pistons have had players go with 50, 40 individual games in back-to-back games. And then it was the second time they've had 40-plus. Terry Mills and Isaiah Thomas did it in 1993. But before we started recording, we decided we wanted to talk a little bit about something that's been coming up recently, and that's the play of the second unit. And it showed up big time in the Cleveland game. That second unit came in, I believe, at the end of the first quarter, lost the lead, but then ended up playing really well to start the second. But it did not go that way at the end of the third to start the fourth.
No, it didn't. And part of the issue with the second unit, and I'll add, that was the first game we saw that. Their last game against Boston, we saw them compete until the second unit came in, and then the wheels kind of fell off a little bit. But they've had some injuries. I mean, Frank Jackson's been out for a bit with a back issue. Hamdi's missed some games, had a one-game suspension, and then I think a sprained finger now. And Achilles missed some time. So you've kind of just had guys coming in and out of that unit, and I think it's disrupted their flow a little bit. But also, I think when you look at the rotation, we haven't been seeing Cade, Saddiq, and Jerami staggered at the end of games as much. We're seeing them all come out in the third quarter, and that's typically when teams go on the run. So then they usually come back in maybe a little bit earlier if the team goes on a big run. Like last year, Cleveland went on like a 24-4 run. Those guys come back in at the beginning of the fourth quarter, like 3 minutes into the quarter maybe. And by then, every team's already caught fire. Cavs are a better team, obviously, and it's kind of hard to make up that ground. I asked Dwayne about that a few weeks ago, and he did say it's just more so looking at units. And he did acknowledge pretty explicitly, like, we're not playing, to
I remember this quote.
Right
he was pretty transparent, right?
He's like, we're looking at lineups. We're trying to see what works, what doesn't work. And beyond just giving the bench a chance to prove itself, it's also, I think he wants to keep Saddiq, Jerami, and Cade together, because they want to get a good look at how these guys fit together going into the offseason, because we've talked about, decisions they have to make with Jerami and whatnot. So it's good to get a read on that. So from an overall team building standpoint, I think it does make sense that he is handling the rotation that way and maximizing the amount of time those three guys are on the floor. And obviously people would say it's a tanking move. And I mean, that's not incorrect. I mean, if you're not playing to win, then that's not a bad conclusion to come to. But I think that's what it is. Like, they're evaluating. They're seeing that the team's better, that the team can compete, so it doesn't hurt you too much to allow Saban to figure some things out. To allow Marvin to figure some things out. Like in the grand scheme, that gives you information you can use for the future. So you can call it a tank move, but I think there's some validity to it as well. Even if as a fan you do want to see them win, or maybe you don't. Like, I could never get a read on the fans whether to win or lose, because it seems like they're mad.
It's a way to crush Dwayne Casey. And so it's a way to critique his subbing and his lineups, because it's like, oh, he doesn't sit down and find a way to stagger the lineups. And I think I'm really interested to see, because I think you're right. I think you're killing two birds with one stone. I think it works all in all, because Oklahoma City's right on the Pistons' heels right now, right. In terms of bad records, obviously, as you look at the reverse of what hopefully we're looking at here in a couple of years in terms of winning. So in terms of losing, but they let those guys play together. That's a great point with Cade, Saddiq, and Jerami. They haven't got a ton of minutes in games because of different injuries, so the chemistry there. You get a look at Isaiah Livers, Saban Lee, Jamarco Pickett's even got some minutes recently. And then also, does it hurt that when they have a 4-point lead at the end of the third, that ends up being a 6-point deficit when those guys come back in? Plus, you can see what those guys can do in the fourth playing from behind. So I do think it all kind of plays together. I am interested to see next year. Real quick, Omari, before we move into segment 2, do you think even as soon as next year you'll see a little bit of the shrunk rotation where maybe he's only playing 8 or 9 guys a night and we see some staggering of minutes between those players?
I think so. I think the thing kind of hanging over all of this is that this is still a roster with $30 million in dead money. Well, actually a little bit more than that on the books, and then Blake comes off this offseason. So, you could try to go after one guy, or probably more realistically, you just fortify the depth of the squad as a whole, right? Like, you look at what Atlanta did before they made the Eastern Conference Finals a couple of years ago, where they went out and they got Gallinari, and they just went out and got some guys that could play, and they became a lot deeper. So if you go out and you get some guys and you're a lot deeper next season, and there's some guys in the rotation now who are pretty good. If you're trying to win games, you probably don't want to rely on them as hard. That's a pretty good situation. So I can see that happening next season. Like, I definitely think they're going to make a bigger push to try to win next year. As they should. Like, it's year 2 with Cade, year 3 with the 2020 class. You should be trying to win games at that point. And from a depth standpoint, they should be in better shape. So I could definitely see that.
So we're going to take a short break right here, but we'll get into that with a quote from Dwayne Casey after the game on Saturday against the Cavs, as well as some quotes from Isaiah Livers, Saddiq Bey, and from Omari's interview with Dave Bing.
I'm Alyssa Robinson for the Detroit Free Press. When you wake up every morning, what's the first thing you do? Check your email? Me too. And when you sign up for our daily briefing newsletter, you'll get all the latest news sent directly to your inbox so you can wake up and be ready for the day. We also have newsletters about COVID-19 in Michigan, the latest entertainment headlines, as well as Woodward 248, a newsletter specifically for people living and working in Southeast Oakland County. And don't forget about automotive headlines and all the latest news from our Michigan sports teams. We have a newsletter for every personality and preference. Just head to freep.com/newsletters to sign up for any one of these great options and more.
We're back with segment 2, and we're going to try a new segment where we dive into some of the more notable quotes from the past weekend. And the first one we're going to do here is actually talk to Dave Bing. Last Tuesday, I know he's everyone's favorite right now after what he said about Cade back in December. And I actually reached out to him because I saw him at a Pistons game that previous week. And it occurred to me, like a lot of times when people are on TV and they speak off the cuff, what they say does not always come across properly. And, you know, his quote was a little contradictory where he said he wasn't sure if Cade was like the guy you could build around, but also said he saw him being like an all-star talent. So I had kind of heard that he had been wanting to clarify his words a little bit, so we talked and, of course, people were interested in what he had to say. Like there was a lot of negging on Twitter, of course, but, I saw the message of the story. It did pretty well. So clearly the interest was pretty high. But the initial quote he said was, Cade is a hell of a player. He's going to be an all-star for years to come. I think he should be Rookie of the Year. He's unique in that he doesn't have many weaknesses. He's a guy who consistently will get 20 points, 6 or 7 rebounds, 5 or 6 assists a game. We could go on. I think he has a very bright future, and I surely wish him the best of luck because now, as he's growing, this organization is going to do well by drafting him number 1. And, and that's a pretty strong quote, right? And I think that there is, people will say, well, if he's an all-star, why are you saying he's not the guy, this and that? I think people kind of looked at his initial quote selectively, where he said that he didn't think Cade was the guy. Because you could be Rookie of the Year, you could be all-star, you could be all of that and still not necessarily be the guy who's a number 1 option on a championship team, right? Like, that's like Paul George tier or a lot of good guys, right? Like Kyrie, like, whoever you want to say, even maybe James Harden, if you look at him being the second guy next to Embiid right now, or like he was in Brooklyn next to Durant. I don't know. Like, of course, like I'm a beat writer. I'm not always going to agree with fans, but, I thought people kind of latched on to the negative part, but didn't also look at the fact that initially he did say he thought Cade was an all-star guy, right? Like there's still like a lot of praise there. And he did come on a little bit stronger the second time around, right? Like I think he should be Rookie of the Year. People could take what they want from that, but to me, that initial quote, I did not think he was trying to put Cade down, and he did say that he was more so just saying that's all the pressure to put on the guy when they come in. Like, I think that's all pretty fair. Like, I mean, folks can disagree, but I didn't think that was that flagrant.
Being on live TV is completely different than even what you and I do, right, Omari? Like we are able to record these and we can edit out where we stumble over words or misspeak with a fact or a stat. When you're on live TV, it's there and it's on Twitter 30 seconds later, not even 30 seconds later. It's all over. And so you do have to be, that's a lot tougher than doing podcasts like what we do. I remember whenever Bing said it, and I think, I guess I'll put my fan cap on right now. I was like, what is he talking about? Like, just give Cade his due. Cade is, because I think for me, though, Omari, it's because I do believe in Cade as a franchise guy. Like, I've seen enough. Maybe I shouldn't. I think his point is, I don't need to speak for Dave Bing, is like, we haven't seen it yet. He's 19. That's what he said. He's 19 when they drafted him, 1 year of college. He's only halfway through his first year in the NBA. So like, do we really know? There's definitely a world where Cade Cunningham isn't the face of the franchise for the Detroit Pistons and a franchise player. I think he is, but I don't think it's completely asinine to think that he's not. Like, that's a completely fair take that I would disagree with, but I suppose I respect and would understand why somebody would have it.
And he also said this back in December. So, of course, Cade had a really poor shooting start to the season. And, I mean, Cade's had some amazing games this season. So, I think we could feel pretty good about him not being a career 32 or 33% three-point shooter or wherever he is now. But I think overall it was more so, I think people were like, even if he feels that way, you don't have to say it because you're one of the greatest players ever and you're an ambassador of the team. This and that, but athletes are a little bit different. Like, he's a former athlete. Like, I know Shaq says all the time, like guys who played before him would challenge him and, not crown him before he had accomplished anything. And he would say that he appreciated that as he grew up, and Shaq's pretty hard on guys now, especially centers. And people said, some of that may also just be Shaq being salty. Maybe it is.
He's gone after Embiid, right? Shaq has?
Like he's going after Embiid, but he's also giving Embiid a lot of props because Embiid's had a great season, and if Cade lives up to those expectations, then nobody's going to be able to say a whole lot bad about him. But overall, like, I just didn't think that initial quote was as bad as people said it. Like, like when you go on TV and you say, I don't know if he's a guy, that sounds really bad. But he also said he was an all-star talent, so it isn't like he said, I don't think he could play in the NBA. Like, that's still a lot of praise there.
Yeah, I think another thing that's going to be hard with Cade, Omari, is Cade seems like such a great dude, a genuine dude, signing autographs, doing all these things. I think anytime, and this probably isn't fair, but anytime there's criticism of him, I think people, especially Pistons fans, are going to be very defensive of that. And you can understand that because he is more than just the face of the franchise on the court. He's the face of the franchise off the court. And I'm not saying he's perfect. Like, I don't want to build him up on this pedestal. But whenever a player seems to do all the right things in that way as well, I think it makes it hard to critique, or you become very defensive of critiques of on the court things. And I think as fans, we're going to have to be able to separate that. Like, he may be a great ambassador and put the buffs on and embrace the city and all of those things. But if he's not, getting it done on the court, which so far he has, like, people are going to critique him. And I think you have to be able to separate those two things.
You do. Overall, and there's a part of a quote I didn't read. His quote about him not wanting to crown Cade too early. He said, to put a tag on Cade when he first came in as a franchise player, I think that's unfair to him. He's a kid. He's 19 years old when he drafted him, 1 year of college, and was only halfway through his first year in the NBA. And that's a hell of a lot of pressure to put on a young guy. My position is that let him grow as a person, let him develop as a player before anybody puts that kind of tag on him. And I mean, he's the number one pick. He's going to come in with a lot of hype. Like, I think that's perfectly normal for a number one pick, but that's also pretty rational. I mean, he hasn't accomplished anything yet. And I think when guys first come in, there's a honeymoon phase, and then eventually reality sets in, like, winning is hard, right? Like, you're probably going to take some lumps before you actually get to that point. I mean, how many years did it take Michael Jordan just to have an actual playoff run, right? Like, that's pretty normal. So, pretty rational. Like, you could disagree. Like, I think it's perfectly fair to disagree with what he said, but I was just surprised that people were so mad about it 4 months after the fact, basically. So that's why I thought. So that was my reason for reaching out and giving him a chance to kind of restate what his opinion was, whether he wanted to, flip from the original one or just flesh it out a little bit more.
And make sure you go check out that article on freep.com if you haven't. But let's move on. We talk about Cade Cunningham all day. I love Cade Cunningham. I love what he's doing. But let's talk about another guy that has quickly become one of my favorites, Omari. I've talked about it before, and that's Isaiah Livers. Coach Casey had a quote after the Miami game on if being a 4-year college player helps Livers. He said, it helps. Believe me, experience in this league, there's no replacement for that. I just thought that was interesting as we'll talk about March Madness and some of those players in terms of age and how many years they've been in college in segment 3 and moving into, the draft talk through the next couple months. I thought that was interesting for a guy like Isaiah Livers, who we all in the Pistons fan base, we rave about his basketball IQ and his maturity and the little things he does. I think stuff like that develops as you play more years of college basketball for some guys.
It does, and I think, you look at the Pistons and how they drafted last year, especially in the second round, they definitely, like him, and then, of course, Luka Garza, 4-year guys could come in and contribute right away. We've seen that with Isaiah. Of course, he missed like a year of action with that stress fracture in his foot. But he comes in, and then he had a really, really, really nice game against the Miami Heat. He had 16 points. Like, he plays really mistake-free basketball. He's a solid defender. I think he hit 4 or 5 threes that game. Just extremely solid, and the consistency hasn't been there yet, which I think some of that is just he missed so much time that it's expected that it's going to take him some time to find his rhythm. But yeah, I mean, he's a 4-year guy. He was a great shooter all 4 years of college. Like, he's going to come in, and there's some things he's just going to be able to do, and it's going to translate pretty quickly. So that helps for sure.
Absolutely. I really like his game. The shooting has to be there. We've talked about this. I don't need to say it again, but he does all the other little things. Real quick, because I want to ask this. This wasn't a mailbag episode. I'm sure we'll have one of those soon, guys. But RB Nesbitt has been a longtime supporter of what we were doing at Motor City Hoops and now of the Pistons Pulse. And he essentially asked a question about the competition between Hamidou Diallo, Frank Jackson, and Isaiah Livers. I think he was talking about this year, but I actually would be surprised if we see Hami or Frank the rest of the season. I don't know if you can give any insight on that. But really, here's my question, Omari. Going into next season, who do you think the front runner is? If you had to pick one of those 3 guys, not Troy Weaver, I'm not asking you to put your GM hat on. I'm just saying you. Who would you choose if you had to between Hami, Frank, and Isaiah Livers?
I would probably go Hami, and I think you're probably giving up something, whoever you pick in this situation. But if Hami can become something of a knockdown 3-point shooter, because I think some of what you're not getting from Hami, like he's not the best defensive player. Like, he has the ability to be one, but I don't know if just the possession-to-possession detail is there. But if he could become a knockdown shooter, and we've seen him come off the bench, and he gives you so much energy. If you add the shooting piece to that, I think he becomes a very, very useful role player, and he'll be able to give you some things that you're just not going to be able to get from Frank or Livers. And I think part of this too is that I think both Frank and Livers, Frank and Isaiah are probably better shooters in theory than they are in actuality right now. Frank shot pretty well last year, but his percentage dipped this year. And if he's not shooting it that well, you're not getting a whole lot of those from him. And then Isaiah too, I think he plays really mistake-free basketball. He's a really smart player, but the shooting still has to be there. It's also tough to judge just because Hami's played the most minutes of those 3 guys this season. But I'd probably just go with Hami just because I think he's shown the most. Like, he's the best athlete on the team. Like, he brings so much energy. He's a good rebounder for his size. And if we're talking, like, if he shoots like 36% from 3.
Okay, I was going to ask you to put a number to it, because when you say knockdown, I know you're not saying like 40, something like that. Nobody's expecting him to do that. So that's what's the number? Because I actually agree with you. I'm just, it's recency bias for me. I love Isaiah Livers' game, but I'm a big fan of Hami and Frank. Hami brings something athletically that those 2 guys just absolutely don't, and some juice that goes with that, and production that comes with it. But the shooting's got to come, right? Like, what's the number, Omari?
Yeah, I think if you get to like that 36% range where you just can't leave him open, right? Like, he's a threat. Like, he could probably get you 2 or 3 threes a game every few games. Like, to me, that's like the magic number for him. Like, if he's doing that, then he is a productive role player, and he's probably going to play more often than not.
If he could be a 35, 36, just where you have to actually respect it and it keeps spacing, then I think for sure. I'm just not sure that I personally believe he's going to get there. Another quote from Isaiah Liver on the team's recent play. We talked about it earlier, how it's been a good stretch from this team since the All-Star break. He said, "We're sharing the ball, and that creates happiness. Happiness goes a long way in the game of basketball." So this is just going to be kind of a more general topic, but with this Pistons, it looks like there's more chemistry. And I know when the ball goes in the basket and the team's winning solves a lot of issues, Omari. Like, I've learned that if there's one thing I've learned from my time around the game of basketball as a player and coach, when you're winning, it solves a lot of things. Not always, but a lot of times. But it does seem like this team has a little more chemistry, a little more together. They're enjoying playing together. You're around them as much as anybody possibly could be that's not a member of the team. Do you see that pregame, postgame at practices?
You do, but I would even say, even after losses, rarely have I seen this team like truly down. So I think there's definitely a more positive vibe now. Like, as you said, winning solves a lot of problems, and I think it's gratifying for this team to see the work pay off. I mean, this is the team that lost 14 straight games in December. It feels like a long time ago, but it really wasn't that long ago. But you're starting to see some of the work that they've been putting in coming to fruition. And, for them, like, that definitely adds a different vibe to what they're doing because you're seeing the payoff. But like, I would also just say I've not really seen this team ever truly get down. I think they've had pretty good chemistry. I think a lot of that's just because Dwayne Casey in the front office has properly set expectations, and that's sort of a tricky thing to thread where you can lose games, but you can focus on the big picture, and those individual losses don't necessarily feel like failure because you have coaches in your ear, and like you're talking to Trey, like people around the team, and they're telling you as a player that we know you're putting in the work, and we have faith that this will pay off, right? So I think managing expectations is a big part of what goes into that. And yeah, like there really hasn't been a lot of drama this season. I mean, the most dramatic thing was like Hami, like I think it was that Cleveland game
with him and Coach Casey.
Yeah, with him and Coach Casey. And you check Twitter, and you think the sky's falling, but that's all that's the only thing that happened out of it, right? And now Hami, like he's been hurt, but he's been a pretty productive role player. So yeah, like Isaiah, like the sharing the ball that creates happiness, that goes a long way in the game of basketball. And this is just a continuation of what's been happening all season. Like, you didn't see the wins early on, but there's still a lot of stuff behind the scenes that even as media, I mean, we don't always see. Like, we're not watching every minute of practice and whatnot. And it's starting to pay off now. So, I think that's just what they talk about all year. We're not going to win now, but we're building toward the future. And at some point, you're going to start to see that progression on the court.
So real quick, before we get to the final quote, how much do you think you have the number one pick? There was a lot of expectations at the beginning of the year, Omari. Right or wrong, rational or irrational, maybe not necessarily from the team, but from the fan base. A lot of pressure, a lot of disappointment when the season didn't start out right. Cade wasn't playing. Other injuries happened. Killian Hayes, Saddiq started off tough. And then you closed in on the trade deadline. So they're losing, didn't meet quote-unquote expectations. You have the number one pick. And then one of your best players is the biggest name on the trade market. How much do you think the weight was lifted off this team's shoulder, or their monkey was off their back, however you want to say it, when they got past the trade deadline and Jerami Grant stayed, this was the roster, some guys had started to play better, and they could just play basketball and not have to worry about things. So, I mean, eventually they're going to have to play with expectations, but I just can't help but wonder if some of those things were bogging them down.
I think that helps. I don't know if it bogged them down because this is a younger team, and a lot of these guys have not really seen. Well, I'll take that back because the whole Blake stuff did go down last year, so they have seen it. I don't think it bogged them down. Like we asked Dwayne about it a few times, and he said, when your name is in the news and your name is in the rumors, that's a compliment, right? I think it helps when the guy who was in the rumors, that being Jerami, is a veteran guy, and he's been traded. I mean, like he's not new to this, so it's not something that he had dealt with for the first time. It's not a situation where you have a guy that you would expect to get traded, like Saddiq or somebody gets moved, and it's like, okay, like I didn't know that could happen. But you get past the trade deadline, and not Jerami, like he's getting healthy, and he knows he's going to be here for a little bit longer, and and then you can lock in. You can figure out how to fit next to Cade, how to fit next to Saddiq. But I also think more so than just getting past the trade deadline, I think the move that happened at the trade deadline where you swap Trey Lyles for Marvin Bagley just balanced the roster out in a way that also just helped those guys play a little bit better. I mean, they're tossing some of the lives to Marvin Bagley now. And I thought Trey was probably better than you would expect for the role that he was in. But he was still not in the role you would want of him being a small ball center where, he could take guys off the dribble and score 17, but, he's probably also giving up 17, if not more. And then, there's a rebounding deficit too. So the trade deadline, I think, balanced the roster out. And I think that coupled with guys getting better, coupled with maybe some of the distractions from guys being in rumors, like it's all those things at once. I wouldn't just say it was the trade deadline as a whole, but everything that went into that.
Kind of box score watch. Trey Lyles has been starting for the Kings, putting up some decent numbers. Josh Jackson has not been getting any minutes with the Kings, at least in the box scores I have checked. We're up against it here because I want to leave plenty of time for segment 3, which is our March Madness, the first weekend of the NCAA tournament. So kind of quick here on this final quote. This was Coach Casey on Saddiq. This one was very interesting to me. I'm going to read the whole thing, but just ask you about one part. He said, "There's nothing about Saddiq Bey that's selfish." Love to hear that. You just continue to hear great things about Saddiq Bey on top of what he does. And then he said Saddiq has his summer workout plans already mapped out with ways to improve his game. So here's my question from that quote, Omari. If you could do one thing, and we'll talk about this, I'm sure, throughout the offseason, but if you could improve one thing in Saddiq's game going into next season, what would it be?
If he becomes like a 20% better ball handler, then, I mean, he's firmly an above average shooting guard. We already know he can shoot. I think the vision's been there. And I know Dwayne said that he could be like one of Detroit's pick and roll creators, which he keeps his head up, like he makes the right pass a lot. I think that's already there. You don't even become Chris Paul. You just want him to be able to move the ball and make the right read. For him, I think a lot of that is just tightening that ball handling a little bit better, so he can get to the rim a little bit easier. He's not taking as many contested mid-range shots. I think he's been a lot better at that for sure, as far as just making decisive moves to the rim and not sort of dallying and the like in between the rim and the 3-point line like he was doing earlier in the season and during summer league. So we've seen that progression already. But like if he can really come back and really be that type of ball handler where he can get to like that step back a lot easier, he can make decisive moves to the rim and just finish. I think that would unlock a lot for him. So I'm sure he'll continue to work on that. He'll continue to work on his shooting, continue to work on his vision and all that. But if he tightens out ball handling a little bit more, I really think that'll get him where he wants to be.
I got you. So I would go with his finishing around the rim. I think he's done a really good job, I think, getting there. I think he could use a little bit of touch finishing around the rim. And I'm really close. I would be really, because you brought up him being a shooting guard, so this is a whole nother conversation. But if it also might be perimeter defense. Man, if he could guard a little bit better on ball on the perimeter against like true guards and wings, I think that would go a long way for this roster and this team as well. But we'll save that for another episode down the road. Right now, we're going to take one more very short break here, and then we'll come back and finish up the episode talking about the first weekend of the NCAA tournament and what we saw from the top guys in the draft.
All right, hey, Carlos, just a quick idea. How about if I say, hey, this is Sean Windsor, and you say, hey, this is Carlos Morales, and I'll go, and then we'll go back. You want to try that?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay, you ready?
Yep.
Hey, this is Sean Windsor.
And this is Carlos Benares.
And we are the team behind Free Press Sports with Carlos and Sean, where we are going to talk about, you guessed it, sports, but lots of other stuff. Like what, Carlos?
Oh, we're going to talk about your favorite subject, Sean, food. Probably more food. Arts, culture, sports, TV, movies, you name it. If it's happened in Detroit, we're going to talk about it.
And sometimes we're going to have guests in who obviously know a lot more than we do about just about everything. But we're going to have some Free Press journalists to talk about big stories, folks from the sports world. We're going to be out every Thursday. You can find this podcast wherever you find your podcasts, Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts. We hope you'll join us.
So before we get to the NCAA tournament talk, we did get some new ratings and 2 new comments on Apple Podcasts. And we just want to say we appreciate you guys so much for all of those ratings, all the comments on Apple Podcasts, the ratings on Spotify. All the feedback we've gotten so far is really, really appreciated. It's been really a positive, and we hope we continue to put out a good product that you guys enjoy. This first rating is from Yoda Nasruddin, and if I mispronounce that, I'm so sorry, but they say, let's go, a top 2 team. We really appreciate that. And then the second one is from Nunya 1979. This is a little bit longer, but Omari and I both really appreciated the time you took to write this. And they say, hate to repeat the show bio, but between the insight from Omari, the growing professionalism supplied by Bryce, and the incredible budding chemistry between the two, this podcast has the potential to be truly special. As the team, they spend the majority of the show discussing going from new to great. I would anticipate this show mirrors that arc. They seem to understand that getting to know the people behind the voices is as intriguing as the analysis they offer on the team, a recipe typically reserved for very successful programming. Between Amari's quote-unquote hot takes and Bryce's honest portrayal of what it meant to try to behave like a pro while simultaneously suppressing some fanboy tendencies, these guys balance content with entertainment almost perfectly after only 3 episodes. I'm a fan, and I can't wait to see what they bring to the stream moving forward. Omari, I know we appreciate every comment, but that one I feel like stood out to the both of us.
No doubt. It was just super in-depth. Like, you could tell they really appreciate the pod. I like how they sort of projected just the future growth of what we're going for here. We could just tell that they were really a fan, and we really appreciate all the support we've gotten so far. We've had a ton of fun through the first 3 episodes. We're going to keep it going, keep building momentum. We appreciate all the comments, and feel free to leave super in-depth ones like that, because I think me and Bryce really appreciated that.
Absolutely. And whether it's on Apple Podcasts, whether you send us a DM on Twitter, comment at us on Twitter, send us an email, whatever it is, guys, like reach out. We love to hear feedback. Even if you have something you want to hear different on the show or you have a suggestion, like we're always up for any of that stuff. I really like that too. He compared the arc of the Pistons Pulse to the arc of the Pistons team, which I hope we both grow together. And then also the chemistry. That was a huge part of why I came to Detroit, Omari, was to meet you in person again and spend some time. So we could build that chemistry. Also got a chance to meet Wes for the first time in person. But we had a big weekend of NCAA tournament games, Omari. Are we going to talk Michigan or Michigan State?
We can go ahead and lead off with Michigan State, of course, my alma mater. And unfortunately, they did not come through with the win against Duke. But I will say that this Michigan State team, I don't think they had that second gear that you have to see from Izzo teams. And I think part of that's just certain guys didn't quite step up the way you would want them to. And Duke was just a tough matchup. We talked about Ben Caro. Of course, he's a great prospect. They didn't really have an answer for him. Can't say I was surprised by the outcome. It's unfortunate, but Duke was the better team.
Yeah, Duke is loaded, and we're going to talk about them in a little bit more in depth in here a second, especially Boncaro and AJ Griffin. But they might have 5 first-round picks on that Duke team. That is a loaded, very talented squad. Michigan State gave them all they could handle. Their first game, obviously, Michigan State played Davidson. I know we're kind of talking top of the draft guys, but as we get more into this, Hung-Jung Lee, the kid from Davidson, is a name you guys may hear us talk about because the Pistons do have a second-round draft pick, and we will talk about that. I want to ask you about Max Christie before we kind of get a little bit more into the top guys. What do you think Max Christie is going to do, and what do you think he should do? He's not necessarily a lottery guy, but he's a guy I've heard talked about being a first-rounder.
So the thing about Max Christie is I think he's still more potential than legitimate NBA player right now. And he's 19. Of course, he coming as a 5-star recruit. Some guys pan out immediately, some don't. But he's got to knock down more threes. You're a 6'6" wing, and the shot just really hadn't been there this season. I think he shot around 32%. Didn't really see him really be able to step up in the big moments as much as you would want. So to me, just from a draft standpoint, I think if a team takes him, it's more so we know he could be a good player now, and we'll just get him into our development system and trust that the work he puts in will eventually pan out. And I would compare that to maybe what the Spurs did this past draft with Josh Primo.
Yeah, I think the term everybody uses right now is pre-draft. So essentially it's you draft the guy a year early and you can get him in the 20s, the end of the first round, and have team control over him. You get him in your system, as opposed to if a kid like Max Christie goes back to school and then maybe blows up as a sophomore, which we have seen some of these guys do that we're going to talk about in Jaden Ivey, Benedict Mathurin, even Johnny Davis have kind of blown up in their second years. But before we get to those guys, we do have to talk about Michigan, Omari, and that might be tough for you as a Michigan State alum, but they had a really, really nice weekend with Juwan Howard. They upset in the first round against Colorado State. They have a kid, the David Roddy kid. I don't know if you watched that game or not. That's a second round possible guy that's a really intriguing player just at his size. But they beat them, and then they pulled the upset over Tennessee. Not a ton of high-end draft prospects in either of those games. Kennedy Chandler, I thought, was the best draft prospect. But I don't know what you do with Caleb Houston and Diabate. I think they're in the same kind of boat as Max Christie, but a really good weekend for the University of Michigan.
No doubt. Michigan came into the season with a lot of hype, so I don't want to give them too much praise, right? You have a disappointing regular season, and then you come in and you kind of hit your stride late. But no, they played a really good game against Tennessee. Though I don't think anybody's ever doubted that this Michigan team is talented, and because that game started right before the Pistons played the Cavs, I missed most of it. It was like a 5:50 tip, and I had pregame, and I just wasn't able to watch most of it, but did watch, some clips after and read about it. Of course, we covered the game at the Free Press as we always do. It's a good Michigan team. They have depth. Hunter Dickinson is just to be a quintessential Big Ten center, just a big dude who can hit a jump hook over anybody. It seems like the Big Ten always has those guys every year. They played a good game. You mentioned they don't have a lot of high-end draft talent, but they do have a lot of guys, as Michigan typically does, who might turn into late first-round picks, early seconds, and then you look up like 4 years later, and these guys are still sticking around in the NBA. I guess I would describe like the Jordan Poole tier. And Juwan Howard, I mean, of course, it's been a interesting few weeks for him, but I do think he's a good coach. Obviously, he can recruit. Things are starting to come together for him. So again, I'm a Michigan State guy in Michigan. I mean, they're a good team. They're playing well, and they deserve to be in the Sweet 16 right now.
Played really well. Hunter Dickinson was probably the best player on the floor, not necessarily the best draft prospect on the floor, but the best player on the floor in that game against Tennessee. And we can't get into the Juwan Howard thing right now. I think what we've seen going back to the incident, and then, I know that it's been going around his interaction with Kennedy Chandler after the game. There is a personal relationship there, but you just see the emotions. And sometimes the emotions come out in a not so positive way. And then a lot of times they come out in a very positive way. And I was glad we saw that from Juwan Howard because, he has to be a good dude. He has to be a great guy. And it's an emotional game, and that's what we want to see from coaches and players. And sometimes, it gets built up a little bit. I do want to make note that they play Villanova. That's going to be a tough game for them in the Sweet 16. And then if they would win, they'll play the winner of Arizona and Houston. Before we talk, again, it's going to be the second time I mentioned this name about Benedict Mathurin of Arizona. I want to ask you, Omari, we've seen all the top guys in the draft. All the guys at the top were playing this weekend. Some are going to continue to play. Some ended up losing. Who were you most impressed by from the top four of Banchero, Jabari Smith Jr., Chet, and Jaden Ivey?
Honestly, I would say Banchero. And he didn't do anything we hadn't seen before against Michigan State. I would say he did a lot of the things that we know he can do. And of course, nobody questions how well he could score the ball inside the arc, and he did that well. But he also punished Michigan State for playing off of him a little bit. He had a couple nice moments where he looked good defending the rim. And as far as he made some good passing reads. And you just look at how his game translates to the NBA. And there's some stuff that's pretty obvious. I mean, you play him at the 5 in the NBA, and he's just going to carve up opposing centers and even a lot of power forwards as well. There's no question about that, but it's just the rest of his game. Can he pass out of double teams? Like, can he protect the rim? Because I don't know if he's going to be a guy who can stick with a lot of guys on the perimeter. And we can talk about this as well if there's time. Just is he a 4 or a small ball 5? But you watch that game, and he just feels like a really safe prospect. I mean, there's some red flags with Chet. There's some red flags with Jabari Smith Jr., who struggled. I mean, I thought he rebounded and had a pretty good defensive game, but he's much more limited offensively than Banchero. And if you're a team with a top 4 pick, I think you could take Banchero and just feel pretty good that he's a guy that, at minimum, he'll probably be able to get you about 18 and 8 a game. If he can knock down threes and he can make those passing reads and even just be an average rim protector, I mean, we're talking about a guy with pretty clear all-star upside. So I thought that was a really good weekend for him. And I'll throw out Jaden Ivey, too. Like, he just played a really good game. Of course, he hit that deep 3 from a few steps behind the three-point arc. And like Banchero, if he can shoot it in the NBA, then he has, Donovan Mitchell type upside, really. So both of those guys really stood out.
Those are, for me, the two guys in my second tier, but they were by far the two guys I came most impressed by this weekend. If we're just talking about this weekend, and I want to make this clarification, Omari, we're not saying that we have to put all of our eggs in the basket of what we saw this weekend, but it was a chance for, I think, both of us, I got to more than you because of your job, to actually watch these guys play full games a little bit more than we do during the season. So I think it is easy to take a little bit more away from that. Just because Jaden Ivey was really good, I'm not saying all of a sudden he should jump up to number 1, but he was the guy that impressed me the most. And the flashes, Omari, are just unbelievable. The athleticism is unbelievable. Earlier in the episode, you talked about if Hami Diallo can develop a consistent three-point shot. If Jaden Ivey is a 35-36% three-point shooter in the NBA, he's the number 1 pick. Like, if you could guarantee me that Jaden Ivey is going to shoot 35-36% from 3, that's all I need to hear, because that's the only questions offensively for me. I know a lot of people will question his passing and his vision. I don't see it. I think he makes really nice reads.
I think so, too. Like, he gets compared to Ja a lot, and I think I wouldn't draft him expecting him to be Ja.
Absolutely.
Because Ja is just a completely different tier, just the way he processes the game and the passing reads he makes. But Jaden Ivey, he's a guy that, if he's a really, really good secondary ball handler and you can trust him at point guard for stretches, then I think that solves a lot of question marks for sure. So for my personal draft philosophy, I would not, like, unless he just comes out and completely crushes the rest of the tournament, I probably would not take Jaden Ivey number one, just for the simple fact that I think you can get a Jaden Ivey tier prospect in the top 4 of just about any draft. It's not as hard to get really, really, really good guards compared to centers. And for me, that still gives an advantage to a guy like Chet, who could just do things that very few guys in the league can do. And I think that kind of goes back to maybe the argument for Mobley over Cade in 2021 as well. It's easier to get a guy with Cade's skill set than it is to get a guy with Mobley's skill set. But if Jaden Ivey can shoot 36% in the league, then he's every bit a tier 1 prospect. And I think you can take any one of those 4 guys and feel pretty good about it. But the shooting is the swing skill for him, 100%.
Yeah, and what I also saw in that game was some really good on-ball defense. Now, I will be the first to admit he gets distracted and a little bit disinterested off the ball on defense. I'd like to see him rebound a little bit more. I think that's hopefully stuff you can coach up. But like when it really comes down to it, I think he's a guy that can really guard on the ball on the perimeter. Let's talk about the other guys. You brought up Chet. You brought up Jabari Smith Jr. Jabari Smith Jr. did not shoot the ball at all very well in the game on Sunday. And I know that has a lot of people worried. You could see the limitations in his offensive game whenever he's not making shots. I really liked that Jabari Smith Jr. was still invested in the game on the defensive end, rebounding, those type of things. But if he's not making shots, it has to worry you a little bit. And I'll be honest, Omari, I walked away from the first weekend with more questions about Chet Holmgren being successful in the NBA than I came away with answers.
For sure. So I'll start with Jabari, and I've compared him to Rashard Lewis on the pod a couple times. And some people don't like that comparison because they feel like it sells his potential short, and maybe it does. But the thing about Jabari is, yes, he's an elite shooter. He's 6'10", high release, unblockable shot, decent athlete. He tries hard on defense. He can do a lot of things, and he projects really well as an above average 3-and-D forward. But if his shot's not falling on offense, then what else is he giving you? And I think whatever team drafts him has to be comfortable with the possibility that he may just be Rashard Lewis with a little bit more upside on defense. And that's not a bad thing at all. I mean, that's still an extremely valuable player. And honestly, he might be a better shooter than Rashard Lewis was. And Rashard Lewis was a really great shooter. But I think Jabari, you look at the last few drafts, I mean, he's absolutely as good as anyone that's come out. But again, NBA teams, like if you just run Jabari off the line all game, what is he going to give you? And there's still a development aspect there that I don't think is there as much with a guy like a Banchero, where you just know that he would just be able to carve teams up inside the arc. And if he could just hit the three, then that's gravy. Definitely some question marks with Jabari there.
Well, they just denied him the ball most of and Auburn's guards weren't very good, but it seemed like they just denied him the ball, or if he caught it, he was pushed way out and then just took a contested jumper. He was never able to go by, do anything in the mid post. The questions offensively, I think, really showed up in that game.
I think so too. Like he's got to get better as a ball handler. I think that's point blank. The other thing going in his favor is that he is young. He's 6 months younger than Banchero, and he's a year younger than Holmgren. So if you just project his upside, and he will get better as a ball handler. Like I have no question about that. Like he's not a finished product at all. It's just more so he's probably a guy where if you project these guys' careers early on, like Banchero could absolutely be better than him, and maybe by the time they're rookie extension eligible. Was 2022, so I guess I'll be 25. Maybe Smith begins to surpass him as it begins to come together for him. But he's more of a project for sure. Like I would say compared to the top 4, he's probably, as far as NBA readiness, he might be third overall behind Banchero, and you can make an argument for Chet as well.
So Chet Holmgren, and I wanted to get through Chet a little bit quicker because I do want to talk about a couple other guys. I came away with concerns. And everybody's going to be mad. People are one side or the other with Chet, right? Like people get mad at me because I talk about his size and his lack of strength and he needs to put on weight. And I'm not saying he won't. Here's all I'm saying, Omar. One, I didn't see a whole lot of offensive punch from Chet in that game on Saturday either against Memphis and Jalen Duren. I'm not saying it's not there. He's done it in other games. I know there's some potential there. I don't know what his overriding offensive skill is. Like, what's he really going to bring? But defensively, you saw some of the concerns as well in that game. You saw him be really good, no question about it. But I saw man, is he going to be able to hold up against, again, not just Embiid and Jokic and those guys, but even second and third tier centers?
Yeah, and I think the concerns in that game were fair. The thing about Chet is that he does compete so hard.
He does compete.
And he uses his length so well that it does make up for just some of the lack of the sheer physicality he can handle. Like there are times where a guy will, like we saw during like outmuscle him on a few plays, but Chet's just able to put his arms up and still contest the shot. He's really good at that. And I think that's what makes you feel good is that, to an extent, is that, okay, like he's going to be giving up a size advantage almost every single night in the NBA. Well, I say almost. I mean, realistically, probably every single night in the NBA. But he's still going to compete. He's still going to play hard. And as he gets stronger, it won't be as pronounced. But you can bully him to an extent. And that kind of goes back to what we mentioned last week, where you probably want to pair him with, I mean, really like an Isaiah Stewart type guy who can handle some of those more physical matchups. And I put this on Twitter as well. The Grizzlies with Jaren Jackson Jr., they like to pair him with big centers as well. Like it was Valanciunas and now Steven Adams, because Jaren's bigger than Chet, but he struggled with fouls a lot. Like he was just a really touchy defender and he would get in foul trouble a lot. And the Grizzlies wanted to protect him from those matchups. You could still play him at the 5 in spurts or the close games if you want. And that's probably what you're going to have to do with Chet coming in, is just pair him with somebody who's a little bit bigger. As far as offense, like he did have a quiet game, and Gonzaga is so deep. And you have guys who could kind of take over offensively that Chet hasn't had to be that guy for Gonzaga a lot. So I guess on some level it does make you wonder, does that limit his upside in the NBA if he's sort of been touch and go as a scorer in college to an extent? With that said, like Chet shot the three so well this season.
He has.
Like I think the way we talk about him sometimes, it undersells the fact that he might just be a really, really, really good stretch 5 who could also finish lobs and attack closeouts. Like he's a good ball handler. He's a little bit more wing-like on offense than I think he gets credit for at times. And when you talk about, the size and everything on offense, like I don't think the way he plays is I don't think that's going to limit him, because he is very much to be a perimeter 5 who could also, function in a pick and roll, lob threat. Like he's got a little bit of a post game. Like he can still do those things. So I don't worry about him on the offense at all, and I don't worry about him on defense as much. To me, he's still the best overall prospect. But you just have to draft him and know that you're going to have to cover for him in some ways.
There's definitely a skill set there. You can see him handle the ball and know that it's there. My thing is, and it comes back to the strength. And he does have more functional strength than what it just appears to the eye. But how when he gets a mismatch, how's he going to push through the contact on a straight line drive? If he gets a mismatch, is he going to be able to post that guy up? How is he going to set screens and like really create contact and create an advantage for the ball handler, or if it's off ball? Like I have some questions. I know it makes it sound like I'm like bashing him. All I'm saying is I came away from this weekend having finally got to watch him for full games, and I came away with some more questions about him. It doesn't mean all of a sudden he's 10th on my board. I'm just saying that like I still have some things I want to wonder, and luckily we're going to get to see him continue to play this upcoming weekend and hopefully a couple more games. Before we get out of here, I wanted to talk Jalen Duren, but we'll save Jalen Duren. Bennedict Mathurin, and I'm so glad I stayed up all night Sunday to watch that game because he went crazy. Everybody's going to talk about the poster dunk, but he had a huge 3 to send it into overtime. I thought he made big play after big play. This is a guy who, whenever we come up with our new big boards, whenever that happens, he may be number 5 on mine, to be honest, Omari. I'm fully bought in on Bennedict Mathurin, and I know you have a little bit of bone to pick with his most common comp.
Yeah, so people compare him to Kentavious Caldwell-Pope, and there's definitely a lot of parallels in their games just being pure 3 and D guys. But I think it sells Mathurin a little bit short. For him to shoot, I think he was 3 of 11 from 3, but still gets to 30 points, hit a really clutch one toward the end. Still just found a way to make an impact even when that shot wasn't falling. He's a little bit bigger than KCP, a little bit stronger, I feel. You look at their percentages inside the arc, and Mathurin's a much better finisher than KCP was in college. Like, I don't know if he has like all-star upside, but I think he could certainly be an above-average starting shooting guard. If the Pistons fall in like that 6th, 7th range and you end up with him, I think you can feel pretty good with that. Like, and I try not to get into fit too much because the Pistons should be drafting for upside and talent, but he also, like, you just pair him next to Cade, and I think it's just pretty obvious how well those guys, both fit together. They're both 6'6". I really like Mathurin's tools on defense. Like, I think he's a pretty solid passer for an off-ball wing. Like, he could just make the simple pass to keep players alive. He had 8 rebounds. Like, I like him a lot, and I think he can be an above-average shooting guard. So KCP is not a bad comparison at all, but I do think he's a little bit more toolsy than KCP was when he was in college.
Yeah, I've decided I don't love the comp because I do just think Mathurin has a more of an upside. I think I looked before we started recording. KCP, what did I say, average? His best year was 14.5 points per game on 30% from three. Like, I just think Benedict Mathurin has a higher ceiling than that. And again, we'll save this for another episode. When you get past that top four, I don't know that I hate drafting for fit because those guys it's all kind of the same tier. So why not put a guy that's going to make Cade more successful? So that's another conversation. I do want to let all the listeners know if you're looking to watch these guys play, you got Gonzaga versus Arkansas. Arkansas has 6'10" sophomore Jalen Williams. So he may be able to hold up or give Chet a little bit of a challenge. Duke versus a Texas Tech team that's known for their defense. So you'll see those Duke guys go against a really good defense. Paolo Banchero, AJ Griffin, who didn't have a good game on Sunday. On Saturday, Michigan plays Nova. Purdue and Jaden Ivey actually get St. Peter's. That'll be an interesting matchup, Omari. I can't imagine St. Peter's have guards that can run with Jaden Ivey.
No, they don't. And also, there's a pretty big mismatch as far as just Purdue being a big team as well. So I think that'll be a fun game. I'm looking forward to that one.
And then Arizona and Benedict Mathurin, who we just spoke about, they play Houston. And Houston is just tough, physical, guards you. So that'll be a really great test for Benedict Mathurin in Arizona also. So another great weekend of college basketball coming up, along with our Pistons playing this week. Make sure you follow Omari on Twitter. Read all of his articles on freep.com covering Detroit. And as we always do, we want to give proper credit and thanks to the people behind the scenes. Editor, Kerry Jr. II, executive producer, Anjanette Delgado, and executive producer, Kirkland Crawford. And of course, our guy producing the podcast, Wes Davenport. We also want to thank all of you for listening to this installment of The Pistons Pulse. Please rate, subscribe, comment, follow us on Twitter, and tell a friend about the podcast so we can continue to grow. Thank you, go Pistons, and we'll talk to you soon.